Mary Shelley's Frankenstein opens with a series of 4 letters, written from St. Petersburg, Russia, between December 11th and August 19th. In these letters, Robert Walton addresses his sister, Mrs. Margaret Saville, who lives in England. Robert begins by describing to his sister the dangerous yet glorious purpose of his travels, which is primarily to find a passage through to the North Pole by sea, to allow for faster travel to neighboring countries. Robert is now in St. Petersburg on his way to Archangel in order to hire a ship and a crew for his journey in June. He recalls the circumstances that have led him to undertaking this expedition. He has inherited a fortune from his cousin and spent 6 long years preparing for the journey. He closes the first letter stating that he has no idea when he will return. He writes again in March from Archangel, where bad weather has delayed his journey. His chief complaint is that he longs for a companion, a friend with whom he can share his intimate thoughts. Robert is a sensitive soul, a poet at heart. He remembers how he wished to be a poet in his youth, and he alludes to Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Robert's romantic, poetic spirit will continue to inspire him on his quest. By July 7th, Robert is well on his way and writes a brief letter simply to say that he is safe, although at the same time he recognizes that he will soon be approaching far more dangerous territory. He promises his sister that he will try to stay as safe as possible and expresses great joy and enthusiasm for his expedition. On August 5th, Robert writes a 4th letter. Here he describes the incidents of a number of days, the 5th, 13th, and 19th of August. He begins with a peculiar encounter on his journey. One day, when his ship is surrounded by ice, hundreds of miles from land in the midst of a dense fog, he sees a man with a dog sled in the ice. However, since the boat is trapped in the ice, the crew could not pursue him. The next day, a man appears with a sled and only 1 dog alive. The crew invites the man onto the ship, but the stranger, who we later learn is Victor Frankenstein, first asks Robert where the ship is going. When he learns the ship is sailing toward the North Pole, the stranger, suffering, distressed, and nearly frozen to death, joins the party. For 2 days the man cannot speak, and Captain Robert recognizes that he is sad and melancholic, as well as being physically exhausted. When the stranger recovers a bit, he is able to answer the crew's questions about why he has traveled so far in a dog sled. The man replies, "To seek one who fled from me." At this moment, the crew realizes they must have seen the sought-after man the day before the stranger appeared, and the stranger becomes very interested to learn that they have seen the object of his quest. Robert closes his writings on the 5th by mentioning how he has deep sympathy for the stranger's grief and is beginning to love him like a brother. On August 13th, Robert expresses his amazement with the stranger's nobility, eloquence, and cultivation. And one day, when Robert confides his belief to him that a life is a small price to pay for the knowledge that his expedition will acquire, the stranger replies, "Do you share my madness? Hear me, let me reveal my tale, and you will dash the cup from your lips." Nevertheless, despite this emotional outburst, the stranger quickly changes the subject. It is not until August 19th, as Robert tells us in the final section of the 4th and final letter, that the stranger agrees to tell his tale. He has decided to tell his story in order that Robert may draw a moral from it that will either guide him if his mission succeeds or console him if it fails. Robert writes to his sister about how he will record this story every day, just as the man tells it, and send the manuscript to her. The letters at the novel's opening function as a very useful literary device. They enable Mary Shelley to frame Victor Frankenstein's narration of his life in flashback, which will begin in Chapter 1. Framing is a common literary technique found as early as Homer's Odyssey. This technique helps to depict the circumstances of the present before beginning a narrative which moves back in time, and in doing so, the frame creates a feeling of suspense in readers, since they learn in the beginning that the tale they are about to read has a mysterious ending. At the same time, this framing device places the readers of Shelley's novel in the same position as Robert Walton. We are learning the tale as Walton does, and both he and we need to decide whether or not the tale is true. Regardless of whether or not we choose to believe Victor's story, the character is surely intelligent, and in many ways Robert's respect for Victor's intelligence represents the Romantic movement's admiration for unbounded heroes, those who transgress boundaries in pursuit of their dreams. This is one of the many examples in these opening pages of the Romantic influence on Shelley's work. But perhaps the most obvious example of such influence in the letters is the many references to the sea in Robert's writing. The sea, with its unbounded, unpredictable presence, represents an unbridled energy that the explorer seeks to tame and conquer by charting and mapping a new course through it. By opening her novel with an explorer who attempts to chart the sea, Shelley introduces a parallel and mirror image for the story of Victor Frankenstein that is to follow. Both Robert and Victor share the desire to control and perhaps exploit the overwhelming forces of nature and push the limits of their intellects and sanity in order to do so. It is up to us to decide whether or not to join them. Question 1. The letters at the open and close of Frankenstein enable Mary Shelley to bookend Victor's narration. This is a common literary technique known as drafting, framing, cataloging, shaping. The letters at the open and close of Frankenstein enable Mary Shelley to bookend Victor's narration using the literary technique framing. Question 2. What does Robert confide in Victor that causes him to ask if he shares his madness? That nothing will stand in his way of reaching the North Pole. That he once killed a man in a street brawl. That a life is a small price to pay for the knowledge that his expedition will acquire. That he lost his license to practice medicine when he was accused of questionable conduct. Robert confides in Victor that a life is a small price to pay for the knowledge that his expedition will acquire, prompting the scientist to ask if he shares his madness. Question 3. Which of the following is not an example of the Romantic movement's influence on Frankenstein? Robert's respect for Victor's intelligence, the many references to the sea, Robert and Victor's desire to control the forces of nature, the emotional outbursts of Victor's character. Robert's respect for Victor's intelligence, the many references to the sea, and the desire to control the forces of nature are all examples of the Romantic movement's influence on Frankenstein, but not the emotional outbursts of Victor's character.